An ordinary battalion at war, history of the 2nd Battalion, the Essex Regiment in the Great War, Episode 2, the opening shots. The 2nd Battalion left the United Kingdom and sailed to France on the RMS Corsica, and research on the 1914 medal roll tells us that 24 officers and 966 other ranks embarked with the battalion on the 22nd of August 1914. The regimental history states that they didn't actually arrive till the 23rd of August, that they moved into a rest camp, a holding camp nearby, and as the name suggests, got some rest, but they were moved off quite quickly, moving up towards the front line where the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, was fighting. Now, pre-war plans made between the French General Staff and the British General Staff allowed for the British Army to cooperate with the larger French Army's operations. And the first engagements, really, for the British Army on the Western Front were around the town of Mons, and the 2nd Essex weren't involved in this due to the time of their arrival. But the next major action on the 26th of August 1914 was the Battle of Le Cateau. Having been fighting at Mons, the British Army, to conform with the actions of the French Army, were having to fall back to the south, towards the sort of direction of Paris, if you like. And the 2nd Corps, commanded by General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, find themselves being pressured quite hard by the German army. And Smith-Dorrien decides that he will stand and fight on the 26th of August because he doesn't feel he can retreat in an orderly manner. And the plan is to fight a stop in action, stop the Germans' momentum, and then they can pull back in a more orderly sense. The 4th Division was pushed forward to support the 2nd Corps in this and moved to their left, to their western flank. And in the sort of speed to get them deployed, many of the support assets of the division, such as the field ambulances, the signal companies and so on, were sort of left behind. So it was quite a sort of infantry heavy, but there was some artillery support. From the map, we can see the 4th Division was on the left western flank. And if we now look at a closer image of this, we can see that the 12th Brigade, which 2nd Essex was part of, were actually on the left western flank of the division. So there's a bit of me would like to argue that the 2nd Essex were holding the end of the line because to their left, to their west, there was no other formalised units, though there were French cavalry units that were meant to be linking up with them and bridging the gap between further French units further to the west. However, the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers actually had troops to the very west, to the west of a town called Essex, which sort of takes that kind of claim away. We can see here a couple of towns that are important. Harcourt on the middle-ish of the slide, and then Essex over to the middle left. And there's a road that joins the two. And the regimental history of the 2nd Essex, written obviously after the war, has quite a good little sketch map of the important areas for this engagement. So the Germans are pushing down from the north, from the top of this map, and the 2nd Essex have kind of come up from the bottom of the map, from the south of the map. They advanced into position, and the picture you can see on the slide was taken in approximately 2014 and shows a sunken road leading forward. And in the centre of the sketch map, where it says 2nd Essex R, right next to the left of the words Harcourt, you can see the shading that represents a sunken lane, and this is that sunken lane. It's leading down towards the road that joins Harcourt and Essex, though we can't see that well in the photo. But what we can see is the Longsart Ridge, which is significant to our story in the background. Another element that will be important in this story is in the photo we can see some brown tiled roofed buildings, and these are in the area of what was a sugar factory at the time. As the battalion advanced up towards the Longsart Ridge, battalion headquarters stopped somewhere in and around the area of this photo, and after the war in the regimental history there's a drawing, a sketch made that shows us the rough positions here. So as the battalion moved forward, much of the battalion took up positions along the road that we can see in the picture, and this is a modern day picture with the sugar factory location being those buildings that you can see there. But B Company and A Company were pushed forward, with B Company moving up onto the ridge to support the Lancashire Fusiliers. Now, there are a couple of accounts that will help us find our way through the Battle of the Cateau from the 2nd Essex point of view. And one of the accounts that we're going to rely upon is that of Noel Mackintosh Stuart Irwin. Now, he was a 2nd Lieutenant with the battalion at the time of this action, and spoiler, he's to survive the war and continue in the military and hold higher ranks in the Second World War. He seems quite an interesting character. He, at this point in the war, is a platoon commander, commanding 13 Platoon, and had only recently joined the battalion a couple of months before the beginning of the war. In another strange echo, you know how I like to use that phrase, it echoes through history. At the time of the Second World War, 1939, 1940, and so on, Noel Irwin's son was also a platoon commander in the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment. And a little sort of side story is that the 2nd Essex served on the Western Front in 1939 to 1940, were involved in the retreat to Dunkirk and evacuated from Dunkirk. And after this fighting, Irwin Jr. Was to write an account called Infantry Officer about his experiences. What's quite interesting is once his son had written a book about his experiences, Noel Irwin decided to write one about his, and this is part of the account that comes from there. Now, one of the things that Irwin notes is that as they advanced towards Le Cateau, he was still wearing a sword, and he decided to discard this, took it off and placed it under the seat of a wagon. Now, there's a footnote in the Irwin Sr.'s book, Infantry Officer, that the sword was actually returned to him from Ireland, and he's got no idea how it got from Le Cateau to Ireland, but when it returned, it found its way to him due to his initials, which I messed up earlier when I was describing his name, and the sword had a lanyard on it which had a white sword knot, which would appear that it had been in the possession of a warrant officer at some point. So they're having to ditch equipment and change their expectations of what they would be doing. But Noel Irwin finds himself with his men just by that road from the image that we saw before, the Harcourt and Esnes Road. And this is how he describes the situation. Lying out in a beet field on a warm August day should have had its compensations, but it was no fun to be doing so in an atmosphere of suspense against a background of gradually rising and approaching sounds of battle. There was nothing to be seen until a steady, growing stream of wounded trickled back down the slopes in front of us, and then through our position to dressing stations in the rear, bringing with it increasingly alarming stories of German numbers and German successes. Then, advancing over the skyline 1,000 yards away, appeared the first German soldiers we had seen. How tall they looked against the sky, how steady and determined their approach towards us down the hill. How long the line seemed to left and right compared with our own fusillades of riflemen. There were, of course, other platoons to our flanks, feeling no doubt as isolated as we did. These support positions withheld their fire with admirable control until the enemy infantry approached within effective range. Then, as if by a prearranged signal, rifle fire crackled along the front. The enemy faltered, many fell, and with a few moments of doubt and a confusion of running figures, the line was stilled. Now, recent research has caused people to question the effectiveness of the rifle fire. Were the Germans actually shot down, as was initially described, or were they just taking cover? But it's an interesting account of that first engagement. Now, a number of the men of the Essex Regiment would write to local papers to describe their experience of it, and one that did this was Private Thomas Bloomfield. Now, he was of Colchester, and he wrote to the East Anglian Daily Times, and this is his description. He had a close call in a hand-to-hand conflict, a German bayonet ripping open his tunic without injuring him. He states that at Cambrai, which is close to Le Cateau, he states that at Cambrai, his battalion with the Middlesex and King's Own Regiment and a battalion of Fusiliers were ordered to hold a certain position. To reach it, they had to march all night through a heavy thunderstorm, and reinforcements promised by the French failed to arrive. While the troops were lying in position, Bloomfield raised his head to reconnoitre, and immediately a bullet whistled past him. and it was found that the British troops were practically surrounded by Germans who had approached them in forms of 3 squares sides of a square. When the British troops were ordered to retire, the enemy artillery was playing on the gap, and our troops suffered heavy losses. The men, however, did not lose heart, and all the time they were potting at the enemy, and they were singing and chafing. One of Bloomfield's comrades was shot through the head, and immediately afterwards he himself received a bullet which passed through his right thigh. He fought on, however, and says that out of 350 rounds of ammunition served out to him, he dispatched 349 to the enemy. The remaining bullet he brought home with him. Similarly, another soldier, Private J.R. Tate, was to write to the Essex Chronicle, and his account doesn't quite match up with any of the others, but that's the way of things. I'm sending a few lines to let the people know how the Essex men kept the Germans off till they were forced to retire. We were near Mons when we had the order to entrench. It was just dawn when we were halfway down our trenches, and we were on our knees when the Germans opened a murderous fire with their guns and machine guns. Now, many of their machine guns seem to have been in an area to the northeast of where the Essex were. We opened a rapid fire with our Maxims and rifles. We let them have it properly, but no sooner did we have one lot down, and up came another lot, and they sent their cavalry to charge us, but we were there with our bayonets, and we emptied our magazines on them. Their men and horses were in a confused heap. There were a lot of wounded horses we had to shoot to end their misery. We had several charges with the infantry too. We find they don't like the bayonets. Their rifle shooting is rotten, and I don't believe they could hit a haystack at 100 yards. Now, interestingly, Tate may accidentally be describing some sort of concept of firing manoeuvre, with one unit firing while another one moves and they drop down and exchange their roles and so on. But as this pressure builds, the B Company, that we can see as the northern bit part of the Essex Regiment there, and A Company have to fall back, and they form up with C and D companies on the Esney and Harcourt Road. They hold this position for some time, and the regimental history describes that they engage the enemy at extreme range of 1,300 yards and check the advance, and that the Germans attack a number of times from somewhere in the region of 7 a.m. through to 11 a.m. Now, the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Goranley, who was back in the sunken lane, could from his position see that the battalion was holding, and after it appeared to be quiet, the companies were told to advance back up onto the Longsart Ridge. And about 1 p.m. they were able to effect this and get onto Longsart Ridge. According to the regimental history, the Essex men found among the German dead many Jaeger with the same Gibraltar badge upon their caps which they bore themselves. It was a Hanoverian battalion who had been comrades with the old 56 in the defence of the fortress 150 years before. So whilst they're milling around on this ridge looking at the German casualties, they come under more shell fire and then under machine gun fire from the northeast, and then to conform with other units falling back, the battalion has to fall back to that road again. Having reached the road, the soldiers stay there until approximately 5 p.m, when word comes that the battalion should fall back. And it starts to pull back to the south and begins what could be called the retreat. Now, there is some difference or some variance about what was the cost to the battalion for this action. The War Diary states that that one officer, Vandeleur, Captain W.M.C. Vandeleur, was killed, and so were 9 men. Lieutenant Round, who we met before, the athlete and hockey player, Lieutenant Smith Masters and 40 men were wounded, and Lieutenant Northey and 98 men are missing. Now, the regimental history, however, gives a total of 141 casualties. My research, using things such as Soldiers Died in the Great War and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, shows that there were 28 men actually killed on this day, killed or died on this day. So, Captain Vandeleur, he was officer commanding A Company during the action, which was one of the battalions that was pushed quite far forward. He was born in the Brighton area, and was educated at Wellington, initially joining the Royal Fusiliers through the sort of militia route, but transferred to the Essex Regiment in 1890. He served in a number of campaigns in India and on the northwest frontier, and had quite a long and diverse period of experience in the South African War. He was awarded the Queen's Medal with 4 clasps and the King's Medal with 2 clasps. Lieutenant Round, who's reported as wounded, was wounded in the knee, and there's a number of different stories about him, but one that came up in the Essex Chronicle later in time is this following report, which was identified by Christine Cox and shared on the Felsted School website. After Lieutenant Round was wounded in the hip at Cateau, he saw a wounded sergeant near, went courageously after him and carried him about 3/4 of a mile to a place of safety. In doing that, the bullet that had entered his hip moved down to his knee, and he succumbed after arrival in England. He never told anything about his own bravery. The sergeant, who also came home, told of it, otherwise it would never have been heard of. And jumping forward, Lieutenant Round died in September 1914 of tetanus linked to the wounds that he had suffered. Lieutenant Northey was confirmed as killed and has no known grave, but a number of Essex Regiment men are buried in the communal cemetery or the civic cemetery in Esney. But as said, as the battalion pulls away from Cateau, it's going to start on the retreat to the Marne, and it's going to find itself in action again very soon.